At 4:15 a.m., the Gulf of Oman. The exact moment the radar screens aboard the USS Gerald are forward went entirely black. There was no radio warning, no propaganda video, just the sudden, deafening roar of 500 autonomous kamikaze drones dropping from the cloud cover, moving faster than human reflexes could track. For the first time in modern history, America's billion-dollar Aegis defense shield had a blind spot. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard thought they were about to secure the greatest naval victory of the 21st century. But they made three catastrophic miscalculations about what happens when you corner 5,000 American sailors. If you have ever analyzed naval combat and felt frustrated by the predictable narrative where the United States perfectly intercepts every single threat with zero casualties, you are looking at an outdated model of warfare. We have seen the simulations of speedboats and standard missiles being easily swatted away. But modern naval warfare has evolved past simple kinetic exchanges. Today, we are breaking down a hyper-realistic combat scenario based on next-generation drone swarm tactics. We are analyzing exactly how a modern United States carrier strike group would respond when their primary defenses are overwhelmed by a sophisticated adversary like Iran and the raw, brutal damage control required to keep a multi-billion-dollar fortress afloat. This is not a story of perfect invincibility. This is the strategic simulation of the day the shield broke and the terrifying reality of modern attritional warfare. 72 hours earlier, Tehran, the subterranean command center of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Iranian Strategic Command recognized a fundamental truth about symmetric warfare. You cannot fight a United States carrier strike group ship for ship or fighter for fighter. A Nimitz or Ford-class carrier brings unparalleled aerial dominance, supported by Arleigh Burke destroyers packed with SM-2 standard missiles and Phalanx close-in weapon systems. For decades, Iranian strategy relied on overwhelming these defenses with hundreds of fast attack boats and conventional anti-ship cruise missiles. But decades of simulations proved this traditional approach always ends in Iranian defeat. The American Aegis combat system is simply too fast and too accurate for conventional swarm tactics to succeed. The frustration for any adversary is that kinetic weapons alone cannot pierce the American defensive bubble. To change the outcome, Iranian planners initiated a fundamentally new perspective on naval engagement. They developed Operation Silent Swarm. The objective was not to outgun the USS Gerald forward, but to blind it. This required a synchronized, multi-domain assault combining cutting-edge cyber warfare with autonomous technology. The plan relied on 500 Shahed 136 variant drones, heavily modified for autonomous swarm behavior. Unlike remote control drones, which can be jammed through their radio frequencies, these next-generation variants operated on a localized, AI-driven hive mind. They did not need to communicate with a base in Iran. They only needed to communicate with each other, constantly adjusting their flight paths, altitude, and targeting priorities in real time based on the immediate environment. But 500 drones would still be intercepted by a fully operational Aegis system. The true weapon, the critical vulnerability that the Iranian planners exploited, was a $50 piece of smuggled malicious code. Months earlier, a sophisticated cyber payload was introduced into the logistical supply chain of the Fifth Fleet. This malware was designed to lie dormant, hiding within the routine diagnostic software of the carrier group's early warning radar systems. Its programming was devastatingly simple. Upon receiving a highly specific, encrypted trigger signal, the malware would initiate a localized denial-of-service attack on the carrier's primary sensor fusion network. It would not destroy the Aegis system, but it would forcefully reboot it. In the context of modern hypersonic and swarm warfare, forcing a system to reboot for 3 minutes is equal to destroying it. January 12th, at 2 a.m., the Persian Gulf, the USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group, is conducting routine freedom of navigation operations. The formation includes the carrier, accompanied by 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers acting as the primary anti-air escorts, and 1 Ticonderoga-class cruiser. The sea state is calm. The weather provides heavy, low cloud cover, reducing visual acquisition ranges. Aboard the carrier, 5,000 personnel are operating in standard nighttime readiness conditions. The flight deck is densely packed with F/A-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters. Below deck, the nuclear reactors are humming, providing limitless power to the ship's massive sensor arrays. The ship is a floating city, heavily armed and completely unaware that the countdown to absolute chaos has already begun. At 3:30 a.m., Iranian launch facilities hidden deep within the Zagros Mountains activate. These are not standard silos. They are modified shipping containers loaded onto commercial transport trucks, making them indistinguishable from civilian traffic. Over the next 20 minutes, 500 drones are launched in rapid succession. They are programmed to fly at extreme low altitudes, skimming just meters above the desert floor to avoid early warning radar. They cross the coastline and drop even lower over the Persian Gulf. Moving at 115 miles per hour, they are silent, dark, and lethal. The swarm utilizes the dense cloud cover to mask their thermal signatures. They fly not in a single massive formation, but in dozens of smaller, staggered attack waves designed to strike the carrier from 360 degrees simultaneously. This multi-layered approach was mathematically perfect. By the time the drones reached the outer perimeter of the strike group, the Aegis network would be undergoing its forced restart. The American sailors would have absolutely no warning. The trap was set, and the United States Navy was sailing into a devastating modern ambush. At 4:12 a.m., the Iranian swarm crossed the final threshold. 50 miles out, in a traditional engagement, this is the exact moment the Arleigh Burke destroyers would fill the sky with SM-2 interceptors. But the sky remained empty. Aboard the USS Gerald forward in the Combat Direction Center, the unthinkable happened. The screens flickered. The primary sensor fusion network froze. The $50 malware payload, lying dormant for months, received its encrypted trigger from a disguised commercial satellite passing overhead. It initiated a cascade failure in the diagnostic subroutines. The Aegis system did not explode, and it was not permanently destroyed. It did exactly what it was programmed to do when encountering a critical logic error. It initiated an emergency reboot. For 3 agonizing minutes, the most advanced naval defense network on the planet was effectively blind. The timing was flawlessly synchronized by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Those 3 minutes allowed 500 autonomous kamikaze drones, flying at 115 miles per hour, to cover the crucial distance between the outer defense perimeter and the inner defensive zone. They bypassed the optimal interception windows for the long-range SM-2 missiles. They slipped past the medium-range Sea Sparrow windows. By the time the Aegis system successfully rebooted and the radar arrays surged back to life at 4:15 a.m., the swarm was already inside the killing jar. The automated alert systems instantly recognized the catastrophic reality. Vampire, vampire, vampire. Multiple inbound targets. Count 500. Range 10 miles. Time to impact less than 5 minutes. The sheer volume of the threat overwhelmed the standard defensive algorithms. There were simply not enough missile tubes ready to fire in the time remaining. The strike group commander immediately ordered weapons free, initiating the most desperate point defense engagement in modern naval history. The destroyers began firing everything they had. Rolling airframe missiles launched in rapid succession, streaking through the dark sky to intercept the incoming swarm. Each missile found a target, tearing Iranian drones into showers of burning fiberglass and shrapnel. But for every drone destroyed, 3 more adjusted their flight paths, using their localized AI hive mind to fill the gaps and continue the assault. The Iranian strategy was brutal mathematics. They knew they would lose hundreds of drones. They only needed a fraction to survive. At 4:18 a.m., the swarm reached the final line of defense. The Phalanx close-in weapon systems. These radar-guided Gatling guns are the ultimate last resort, capable of firing over 4,000 rounds per minute creating a literal wall of depleted uranium metal. Across the carrier and its escorts, the Phalanx systems whined to life, tracking the individual drones and opening fire. The noise was deafening, a continuous, mechanical roar as the automated turrets spun and spat fire. Dozens of drones were shredded just hundreds of yards from the ships, their momentum carrying flaming debris into the water, violently splashing against the hulls of the American warships. But a Phalanx system only holds enough ammunition for roughly 20 to 30 seconds of continuous firing. Against a traditional anti-ship cruise missile attack consisting of 4 or 5 weapons, this is more than enough. Against a coordinated, AI-driven swarm of hundreds of drones is a fatal mathematical limitation. At 4:19 a.m., the terrifying click of empty magazines echoed across the strike group. The Gatling guns spun down, their barrels glowing white-hot, entirely depleted. The shield had cracked. The invincible bubble was broken. The surviving Iranian drones, numbering over 40, were now completely unopposed. At 4:20 a.m., the USS Gerald R-4 took its first direct hit. An Iranian Shahed variant slammed into the port side of the flight deck, detonating its 80-pound explosive warhead directly among parked F-18 Super Hornets. The explosion was catastrophic. Aviation fuel instantly ignited, creating a massive fireball that engulfed 3 aircraft. $70 million fighters were transformed into twisted, burning metal in a fraction of a second. The shockwave knocked deck crews off their feet, severing communication lines and plunging the immediate area into absolute chaos. Seconds later, a second drone impacted the carrier's island superstructure, striking just below the primary air traffic control tower. The blast shattered reinforced glass and sprayed deadly shrapnel through the command spaces. Advanced radar panels were blown outward, and the carrier's internal communication network suffered severe localized outages. Then, a third drone found the worst possible target. It struck the rear starboard elevator, penetrating the lightly armored door and detonating partially inside the hangar bay. The hangar bay is the most vulnerable area of an aircraft carrier, packed with volatile aviation fuel, high explosive ordnance, and dozens of aircraft packed tightly together. The explosion ripped through the bay, igniting a devastating fuel fire that immediately threatened to spread to the adjacent weapons magazines. In the span of 60 seconds, the USS Gerald R-4 had transformed from an invincible fortress into a burning, wounded giant. The Iranian planners in Tehran watched their satellite telemetry confirm the impacts. They had achieved what decades of simulations said was impossible. They had crippled a United States supercarrier. They believed they had won. They believed the loss of the Aegis shield and the destruction on the flight deck would force the American forces into a chaotic retreat. They fundamentally misunderstood what happens next. They calculated the breaking point of the technology. They completely failed to calculate the breaking point of the American sailor. The true battle was not over. It was shifting from a high-tech missile defense engagement to a raw, brutal fight for survival in the dark, smoke-filled corridors of the ship. Below the burning flight deck, damage control teams were already mobilizing, entering a completely different kind of war. Below the burning flight deck, the internal environment of the USS Gerald R-4 was instantly transformed from a highly ordered military command center into a dark, smoke-filled labyrinth. When a third drone penetrated the rear starboard elevator and detonated inside the hangar bay, it initiated the most critical emergency a naval vessel can face at sea: fire. The blast ruptured secondary fuel lines and ignited volatile aviation fuel pooling across the deck. Within seconds, temperatures in the immediate vicinity spiked to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, threatening to melt through the structural bulkheads and reach the lower decks where high explosive ordnance was staged. This is the exact scenario where the traditional narrative of perfect American invincibility falls apart, revealing the raw, gritty reality of attritional naval combat. The Iranian planners anticipated that catastrophic internal damage would force the carrier's command to issue an abandoned ship order, securing their historic propaganda victory. They fundamentally misunderstood the core doctrine of the United States Navy. On an American warship, every single sailor, regardless of their primary specialty, is trained as a firefighter and damage control specialist. At 4:22 a.m., as the automated fire suppression systems in the hangar bay were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of burning fuel, the human element took over. Hundreds of sailors rushed into the blinding smoke, equipped with thermal imagers and heavy breathing apparatus. Their primary objective was not to save the aircraft, but to establish a fire boundary and protect the ship's nuclear reactors at all costs. In the Combat Direction Center, the situation was equally desperate. The Aegis system had finally completed its forced reboot, and the primary sensor fusion network was back online, illuminating the grim reality of the battle space. The radar screens confirmed that while the initial defensive barges from the Arleigh Burke destroyers had destroyed over 200 drones, nearly 250 Iranian kamikaze variants were still in the air, actively adjusting their swarm formations. The American destroyers were running dangerously low on SM-2 and rolling airframe missiles, and the Phalanx close-in weapon systems were entirely depleted of ammunition. The kinetic defensive shield had essentially broken. If the strike group continued relying solely on traditional interceptors, the remaining drones would eventually bleed their magazines dry and sink the carrier. The strike group commander recognized that engaging an AI-driven swarm with conventional ballistics was a mathematically losing proposition. To survive, the United States Navy had to instantly shift from kinetic defense to electronic dominance. At 4:25 a.m., the tactical pivot was executed. Deep within the carrier, in a section of the flight deck miraculously untouched by the initial explosions, catapult crews worked frantically through the smoke to prepare the most critical asset for this specific threat environment: the EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. Unlike the F/A-18 Super Hornets, which are designed to drop precision weapons, the Growler is designed to weaponize the electromagnetic spectrum. Its underwing pods are capable of identifying, analyzing, and overwhelmingly jamming complex hostile radar and communication networks. At 4:27 a.m., two EA-18G Growlers were launched from the carrier's forward catapults, their afterburners piercing through the black smoke billowing from the hangar bay. They did not fly away from the fleet to strike Iran. They climbed aggressively into the airspace directly above the American formation and activated maximum broad-spectrum jamming. The Iranian drone swarm relied on a localized AI hive mind, meaning the drones constantly communicated with one another via encrypted, short-range data links to coordinate their flight paths and targeting priorities. This was their greatest strength, allowing them to adapt to the American missile defenses in real time. But it was also their fatal vulnerability, as the Growlers flooded the local electromagnetic spectrum with massive amounts of targeted interference. The invisible network connecting the drones was violently severed. The hive mind was broken. At 4:29 a.m., the immediate effect was devastating to the Iranian assault. Stripped of their ability to communicate, calculate swarm trajectories, and share targeting data, the remaining 200 drones instantly reverted to their most basic, pre-programmed autopilot subroutines. They lost the ability to perform evasive maneuvers. They lost the ability to distinguish between the massive radar cross-section of the aircraft carrier and the false signals generated by the destroyer's electronic decoys. The highly coordinated, lethal swarm was suddenly reduced to a disorganized cloud of isolated, blindly flying fiberglass airframes. This electronic warfare suppression provided the exact window the fleet needed. With the drones flying in predictable, straight lines, the American destroyers switched their Aegis systems from long-range interception to automated close-in defense. The 5-inch deck guns, normally reserved for surface targets, began firing proximity-fused anti-aircraft fragmentation rounds. The sky above the strike group erupted into a continuous, rolling barrage of flak. Without their evasive AI capabilities, The drones flew directly into the shrapnel clouds. Dozens of drones began falling from the sky simultaneously, their wings sheared off and their internal guidance systems shredded by the American counterfire. Simultaneously, the damage control teams below deck on the USS Gerald R. Ford were executing a desperate, brutal fight to save the ship. The hangar bay fire had spread toward the forward munitions elevators. If the fire reached the elevators, it would travel straight down into the primary magazines, resulting in a catastrophic secondary explosion that would break the carrier's keel and sink it instantly. Captains and enlisted sailors worked side by side in the suffocating heat, manually cranking sealed blast doors closed and dogging the heavy metal hatches to starve the fire of oxygen. They engaged emergency protocols, intentionally flooding adjacent compartments with seawater to create an impassable thermal barrier between the inferno and the ship's magazines. It was a grueling, agonizing battle of human endurance against the unforgiving reality of physics and thermodynamics. By 4:35 a.m., the combined efforts of the Growler's electronic dominance and the relentless barrage of the destroyer's deck guns had systematically eliminated the disorganized remnants of the Iranian drone swarm. The radar screens, which had been completely saturated with hundreds of hostile contacts just 20 minutes prior, were finally clear. But the cost was staggering, shattering the illusion of a casualty-free conflict. The flight deck of the carrier was heavily damaged. Multiple $70 million stealth fighters were reduced to ash, and the internal spaces were flooded and blackened. The invincible American shield had undeniably taken a direct, bleeding hit. The Iranian planners had succeeded in crippling the pride of the American fleet, proving that the modern era of attritional, asymmetric warfare carries massive, unavoidable consequences. However, the Iranian planners were about to discover the ultimate flaw in their geopolitical strategy. They believed that inflicting severe damage on American supercarrier would force the United States to negotiate and retreat from the region. They assumed a bleeding military is a defeated military. But as the damage control teams successfully contained the hangar bay fire and the carrier's nuclear reactors remained fully operational, the strike group's posture violently shifted from desperate defense to absolute, overwhelming offense. The carrier was crippled, but it was not sunk, and the American response to a near-fatal ambush would be nothing short of total annihilation. At 4:40 a.m., the immediate threat of a catastrophic secondary explosion aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford was finally neutralized. The hangar bay fires were starved of oxygen and suffocated by the relentless, brutal efficiency of the American damage control teams. The ship's nuclear reactors remained stable, and the structural integrity of the hull was secured, but the cost of survival was written in twisted metal and scorched bulkheads. This is where traditional military analysis often fails the beginner, presenting a sanitized version of conflict where the United States military suffers near-zero casualties while perfectly neutralizing massive inbound threats, proving total superiority. The reality of modern attritional warfare is far more unforgiving. The invincible defense is a myth when facing a saturated, AI-driven autonomous drone swarm. The United States Navy had just taken a massive, bleeding hit, proving that even a billion-dollar Aegis defense shield has a breaking point. However, surviving the ambush was only the first phase of the engagement. The United States cannot just defend. Standard operational doctrine dictates that they must launch a massive, disproportionate counterstrike that obliterates the enemy's bases and infrastructure within minutes. Aboard the crippled carrier, the strike group commander formally transferred offensive tactical control to the accompanying Ticonderoga-class cruiser. The carrier's primary objective was now entirely focused on damage control, casualty evacuation, and maintaining power to its critical sensors. The objective for the rest of the strike group was absolute, overwhelming retaliation. The American forces were about to demonstrate that while you might be able to crack their defensive shield with a sophisticated cyber attack and a drone swarm, their offensive sword remains the most lethal instrument of kinetic diplomacy on the planet. 72 hours earlier, the arrogant adversary in Tehran had planned for this exact moment. Deep inside the subterranean command center of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iranian strategic commanders were monitoring the satellite telemetry. They had sought a historic propaganda victory, boldly overconfident that crippling the supercarrier would force the United States to surrender or fundamentally alter global power dynamics. They were banking on the assumption that a heavily damaged American fleet would prioritize a chaotic retreat to friendly ports in Bahrain or the United Arab Emirates. They made the fatal miscalculation of confusing a tactical vulnerability with a loss of strategic capability. They assumed the engagement was over. They were entirely unprepared for what the United States Navy calls the counter-battery response. At 4:45 a.m., the two Arleigh Burke destroyers and the Ticonderoga-class cruiser received their retaliatory strike packages via encrypted data links from United States Central Command. The targets had already been mapped by U.S. intelligence long before the first Iranian drone was ever launched. Every missile position that fired, every command bunker, and the cyber warfare facility responsible for the malware payload were locked into the targeting computers. The launch authorization was strictly mathematical. At 4:47 a.m., the vertical launch systems across the three American escort ships violently erupted. In a span of 60 seconds, 120 Tomahawk land attack missiles were expelled from their launch tubes, creating pillars of blinding white fire that illuminated the dark waters of the Persian Gulf. Simultaneously, the strike group leveraged its remaining operational air assets. While the USS Gerald Ford's flight deck was heavily damaged, it was not entirely destroyed. Operating under extreme emergency protocols, catapult crews managed to launch a retaliatory strike wave consisting of 8 surviving F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters and 12 F/A-18 Super Hornets. This hardware roll call is critical to understanding the depth of the American response. The aircraft were heavily loaded with AGM-154 JSOW glide bombs and precision-guided munitions, tasked with hunting down the mobile Iranian launch platforms that the Tomahawk cruise missiles could not track. The American counterstrike was airborne, fully synchronized, and moving at hundreds of miles per hour toward the Iranian coastline. At 5:10 a.m., the first wave of Tomahawk cruise missiles penetrated Iranian airspace. Flying at incredibly low altitudes to evade ground-based radar, the missiles navigated the rugged terrain of the Zagros Mountains using advanced terrain countermatching. Their first target was the network of modified shipping containers that had served as the launch platforms for the drone swarm. The precision was surgical. 20 Tomahawks simultaneously impacted the launch sites, instantly obliterating the remaining drone inventory, collapsing the support facilities, and eliminating the Iranian launch crews. In less than a minute, the entire offensive infrastructure that initiated the attack was erased from the map. 5 minutes later, the secondary targets were struck. The F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters bypassed the Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries entirely, operating invisibly above the chaos. They dropped their payloads directly onto the Revolutionary Guard's primary cyber warfare headquarters located just outside of Bandar Abbas. The hardened facility, which had housed the technicians responsible for deploying the $50 malware that temporarily blinded the Aegis system, was reduced to a burning crater. The F/A-18 Super Hornets followed closely behind, deploying their AGM-154 JSOW glide bombs to systematically dismantle the regional communication relays and early warning radar installations along the coastline. The Iranian military infrastructure in the southern sector was systematically blinded, deafened, and destroyed. By 5:30 a.m., the overwhelming offensive retaliation was complete. The skies over the Persian Gulf began to lighten as the sun rose, revealing the cold, harsh reality of the scoreboard ending. The statistics of the devastation defined the new geopolitical landscape. In the span of 90 minutes, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard had launched 500 autonomous drones. In response, the United States Navy had delivered over 200 precision-guided munitions. The Iranian military suffered the total loss of 15 coastal launch facilities, 3 command and control centers, and their primary cyber warfare division. The enemy casualties numbered in the hundreds. The American response was total and disproportionate. However, unlike the fictionalized military competence porn that saturates traditional analysis, this real-time military analysis must acknowledge the gap in the conventional narrative. The United States did not walk away completely unscathed, and the geopolitical fallout of this exchange would be massive. The USS Gerald R. Ford was heavily damaged, with multiple decks flooded, secondary fires still smoldering, and billions of dollars in stealth aircraft destroyed on the flight deck. The myth of the perfect defense, where dozens of incoming threats are magically swatted away with zero damage, was permanently shattered. The United States Navy had suffered real casualties, and a multi-billion-dollar asset was crippled. If the United States destroys 15 Iranian military bases in 29 minutes, what happens on minute 30? Does this trigger a wider regional war, or does the sheer violence of the American retaliation force a geopolitical reset? These are the unanswered questions that define modern crisis reconstruction. This simulation leaves us with the ultimate insight into modern naval warfare, breaking the predictable mold to offer a modern perspective. We have witnessed the day America's invincible fleet took a direct hit. We have seen how next-generation autonomous drones and cyber warfare can successfully bypass the most advanced kinetic interceptors in the world. The technology can be hacked, the magazines can run empty, and the shield can break. But the defining takeaway for any military strategist or frustrated beginner looking for the truth behind the hardware is this: America's greatest naval strength isn't just its perfect technology, it is the unparalleled grit of its damage control teams when the technology fails. The adversary sought a propaganda victory by exploiting a digital vulnerability, but they were ultimately defeated by the analog resilience of the American sailor. The ships survived, the fleet retaliated, and the reality of warfare was redefined.